Greetings and welcome to the virtual conversation series, Lead Well. My name is Dr. Jeff Stark, and I'm the director for the Center for Theological Leadership and the associate professor of Christian ministry at Olivet Nazarene University, as well as a missionary practitioner in the city of Chicago, where I live and work with churches and nonprofits to help foster innovative church experiences and innovative and collaborative ways to reach the city. This is the third of our 5 discussions in our discussion series, and we are thrilled for tonight's conversation. In the first conversation in January, I spent some time having a conversation with John Ferguson, who's the co-founding pastor of Community Christian Church. They have about 10 locations throughout the Chicagoland area, and we had a great conversation talking about practices to reach the neighborhood in meaningful ways. And then last month, we had a conversation with Esau McCauley, who is the assistant professor of New Testament at Wheaton College. And we had a great conversation about biblical interpretation and how our social location informs our interpretation, and then how that shapes both our postures and our practices. Next month, we'll be having a conversation with Deirdre Brower-Lotz, who is at Nazarene Theological College in Manchester, England, and we will be having a conversation about the gospel in a post-Christian world. And in just a few moments, I'll introduce to you tonight's guest. This conversation is a part of the Center for Theological Leadership's unique mission. The center emerges from the School of Theology and Christian Ministry, but the center itself has a specific mission, and that is to equip, inspire, and empower theologically informed practitioners to engage the mission of God through events, residencies, collaborative learning environments, and innovative experiential opportunities. But short of it, we simply want to be a servant to those who serve the church. And so we are thrilled to have you with us here tonight. And for those who are going to be watching the recording, we're thankful that you would dial in and listen to tonight's conversation. Now, a few ground rules before we begin. For those of you who are on the call, I know we are all pros at Zoom, but I would ask that you go ahead and mute your end for right now. That will help us tremendously. That's something that I feel like we just always have to be reminded of. And tonight is going to be recorded. So if you miss anything, you'll have an opportunity. We will, once we've completed this conversation and edit it down, we will then send that out to everybody, and so you'll be able to access that information later. And we want this conversation to be interactive. So for those of you who are on the call, if you have questions throughout, I would encourage you to, in the chat, look for Dr. Mark Quanstrom. He is the dean of the School of Theology and Christian Ministry, and he's going to be facilitating conversations or questions based upon your queries throughout this conversation tonight. And just one more last suggestion to us here. This is a generous and hospitable environment. We want to create the kind of space where we can have meaningful dialogue about important issues. And when we do so, we recognize that we're not always going to see things the same way or even engage with the material in the same way. But we want to embrace a humble posture tonight. We want to learn to listen and to grow and to feel those moments when we may have some internal pushback, and then to ask ourselves why are we being pushed back against this. But tonight we have a subject matter expert with us who's going to lead and shape the conversation for us this evening. For the next 90 minutes, we are afforded the privilege of growing together. And I want to say this to you: none of this would be possible without the key partnerships that we have at Olivet Nazarene University. First and foremost, church relations, and that is led by Dr. Carlos Lomberger, who's unable to be with us this evening, but he sends his regards. They've done a tremendous job of getting the information for these conversations out across our entire region to hundreds of pastors. And over 100 of you signed up for this particular conversation. And many of you will be downloading this and listening to it at a later date. And we are thankful for that as well. But we also are deeply thankful for the work of the School of Theology and Christian Ministry, and that is led by Dr. Mark Quanstrom, who is a professor, author, and esteemed holiness scholar, and he is with us this evening. And I want to invite Dr. Quanstrom to just offer some welcome and then to pray for us as we begin this event together.
Yeah, I'm not muted. I had to check to see if I was muted. So I am not. You can all hear me. I am really excited about this evening. The previous two have just been so enriching. I'm expecting the same tonight. I've perused Todd's book. I didn't get a chance to finish it today. That was one on my agenda. I didn't get to. I have some. I mean, it from what I've read, it's just is going to be it's a timely book. So I'm grateful for you, Todd, taking the time. But I do want to give credit where credit's due. Jeff Stark, Dr. Stark, is the one who envisioned this series of conversations. And we're indebted to Dr. Stark tonight for this in particular. So thank you. And welcome all. I am looking forward to learning this evening, that is for sure. So shall we pray? Did I miss that or? Okay, so let's pray. The Lord's present, but let's invite us to be aware of His presence, shall we? Father in heaven, this is a privileged group tonight to talk with and talk about what leadership in Your kingdom looks like, and Lord, how to be effective agents of change. Lord, You've called us to lead and not manage, and Lord, that's a different task. So would you help us understand? Would you give Tod Bolsinger the words that needs to be shared? May the outcome of this evening be that we become more effective leaders for Your sake. And we ask this in particular in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Dr. Quanstrom. Well, before we begin, I want to introduce to you tonight's speaker and leader. His name's Tod Bolsinger, and he is at Fuller Theological Seminary and has been full-time at the seminary since 2014, but was an adjunct for almost about a decade and a half before that, prior to coming full-time on at Fuller. He serves as the Associate Professor of Leadership Formation and a Senior Fellow at the Dupree Center for Leadership at Fuller Seminary. Prior to that, he was ordained in 1993 through the Presbyterian Church, and he served as the senior pastor of San Clemente Presbyterian Church from 1997 to 2014. And so one of the things that I find helpful about this entire conversation is that in no way is any of this abstraction or theory. This has been worked out in, and I'm going to use your language here, in a crucible of ministry leadership. And so that bears upon this conversation in a very prudent, powerful way. Prior to that, he was the associate pastor of discipleship and spiritual formation at First Presbyterian Church in Hollywood. He holds a PhD and a Master of Divinity from Fuller. He's taught graduate level courses. He's a prolific writer, contributes to journals on leadership and blogs. Has been asked to be a participant in several podcasts and conversations like this, interviews. And I'm just going to tell a little bit of my story with you, Todd, is that as I was leading a church and trying to figure out how to do this well, I had a key mentor of mine. His name's Jay Hyatt at the Shepherd Community Center in Indianapolis. And I was visiting him one day, and he grabs a book off his desk and he puts it in front of me and he says, if you read one book this year, you read this book. And it was Canoeing the Mountains. And in Canoeing the Mountains was an incredibly helpful text for me as I was processing some of the things that we were doing in ministry. And even as I was coaching and consulting other young leaders along the way. And what I have found is the number of churches and the numbers of leaders that I know who asked their entire church boards to read that book with them and to take them through that journey with that text. Because I think we all sort of realize that this is a moment for this kind of literature to emerge. And I've been deeply impressed by Canoeing with the Mountains, but that's not the only book you've written. You've also written It Takes a Church to Raise a Christian, How the Community of God Transforms Lives, Showtime, Living Down Hypocrisy by Living Out the Faith. I want to pick that one up. It's been about a decade and a half since you've written that one, but that piqued my interest when I saw that. And then the latest book that you've published, which is Tempered Resilience, How Leaders Are Formed in the Crucible of Change. Okay, Todd, that is that's the facts and data. But tell us a little bit about you. What's your story? What brings you to the work that you do? What informs this work? And who have been the formative voices? And what have been some of the formative experiences that has led you to the work that you do currently?
Yeah, Jeff, thank you. And Mark, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be a community conversation amongst folks who are scholars and practitioners who are reflecting on ministry while we're doing it. It's really the lifeblood of my own work and of my own vocation. As you said, I was a pastor for 27 years. I served 10 years in one congregation. Literally, when I was 23 years old, I went to Hollywood Presbyterian. I'd worked for Youth for Christ, running campus life clubs, which are long life clubs if you're familiar. And they invited me to come on their staff as their college director. And they said, we're going to send you to seminary because you're going to run out of those little youth talks you do by Christmas. And I ran out of them by Thanksgiving. So I was glad that they sent me to seminary so I could learn to study the Bible. And I fell in love with the experience of literally learning during the day by doing ministry, reflecting on it in the classroom, driving back and forth about 30 miles between Hollywood and Pasadena. And that process I continued on for 13 years. I did my MDiv, and then I went straight into my PhD. I crammed a 4-year degree into 9 years while I was doing my PhD in practical theology, and was really studying spiritual formation, communal practices of spiritual formation. How do communities change lives? That's the question I wanted to really probe deeply. And that's what I wrote my dissertation on in my first book, It Takes the Church to Raise a Christian, was that. And what was interesting is the book started me on a trajectory that I now have experienced over and over again, which is you have a set of conversations in your own mind and with colleagues, you write something, it goes into the life of the church, and people start asking questions about it that leads you to your next question. So that's what happened to me, writing on spiritual formation and then traveling a little bit to support the book, going to places where people said to me stuff like, hey, yeah, this is great that you want to take the church deeper. Dying. How do you keep the church from dying? And so I started realizing that I was asking a question that was stimulating another question. And that's what happened over and over again. I was teaching a doctor of ministry for another seminary, and it's on leading communities of spiritual formation. That was the title. I was prepared to talk about community and spiritual formation. What they wanted to talk about leading, right? We get that we want a community and we get that people want to do spiritual formation. What do you do when your people say they want to be more deeply connected to each other and they want to grow in Christ, but they just won't do it? Like how do you actually lead the people? And that took me on the journey that I went through, that literally spent 10 years, even in congregation. Same kind of conversations happened that I could talk a lot about my own experience there. And that ultimately led me to do some work on leading change in my congregation, in our denomination. I ended up working with a consulting group that was basically walking with pastors through that process. And then it led me to Fuller, where I came on as the first appointee for Mark Labrador. He became the president 7 years ago. I became a vice president, really trying to work on bringing change to theological education as a way of thinking about, how to form leaders for a changing world. And so that's been my journey. It's been, I'm in one conversation, somebody disrupts it in my own life, leads me to the next one, leads me to the next one. And that's kind of how my books get written and how my life gets kind of led through this process.
I love that dialogical approach to what sparks and moves you to write. It reminds us that as a church, we're always in that conversation. That even those of us who some would say, boy, you've got expertise in this. That expertise is always held with very loose hands, because about the time you claim to know anything, like you said, someone comes along and disrupts that and then sends you down another part of the journey of discovery. And so I really appreciate that. So talk to us a little bit about, every book has an origin story. And so as I'm hearing you talk about spiritual formation and formative practices, and the current content of this book, Tempered Resilience, there seems to be a coalescence of a lot of different passions you have sort of moving towards this text. So you've got this passion for leadership and adaptive leadership. You've got a passion for the way in which lives are formed, and it sort of coalesces. So talk to us about, how did you arrive at the point in which this became your text?
Yeah, so Canoeing the Mountains is really a book about adaptive leadership. It really is a combination of looking at adaptive leadership material that comes out of Harvard with Ronald Heifetz and Marty Linsky and their colleagues. I use family systems theory, particularly as it's used by Edwin Friedman in congregational life, and then missional theology, particularly Darrell Guder was very influential in my life. So I often say, if these three people got together and someone asked them a question about Lewis and Clark, that would have been Canoeing the Mountains. And so what happened is, the Canoeing the Mountains is really about adaptive leadership. Is about the leadership you need when you can no longer depend on your past expertise. So what got you there won't take you forward. You are no longer an expert. You're going to have to lead a group of people by learning and through the experience of loss. So if you're a water person trying to find a water route, like the Course Discovery was, and you've run into the Rocky Mountains, you can't paddle harder. It doesn't do you any good to keep paddling. And you're going to have to drop the canoes to get through the mountains. The hard part, of course, is that the people who came on the trip thought they were coming on a water trip, and they were experts with canoes. They built their own canoes. They invented a boat for that trip. So to tell the people who are experts at water navigating, you're going to have to drop those canoes. Matter of fact, we might need to burn them as firewood to make it through the mountains, is a lot of loss. So adaptive change is about learning and loss. It's about navigating competing values that are both valuable, and how hard that is. So what happened is, that book came out in 2015, and for the better part of almost 5 years, I was traveling around the country talking about it. And then this would happen. After I would finish speaking, the person who invented me, kind of like the two of you guys, would be kind and take me to lunch before they put me back on a plane. And then over lunch, someone would say, "That was really helpful. We hope we can get your slides. Thank you so much for coming. But I just don't know if we have anybody who can actually do that." Well, my first thought was, I've got to do a better job of training and speaking about that. And they said, no, the issue is not that. It's, I don't know if anybody who has the stomach for that. Like, having to actually help people through that kind of loss, that kind of resistance, that's really hard. And the more I heard from people, what I basically began to hear was statements like, I think I could learn to lead change. I'm not sure I can survive it. One of my clients, who I do a lot of coaching now, this is what I do, I do coaching and consulting and speaking. And one of my clients said to me, my inbox is a terrible place to be. And it seems to me like no matter what I do, everybody's mad at me. And this isn't what I signed up to. And so, because that experience was just so demoralizing, I began to look at the question of resilience. And what I found is, there's an overlap between the organizational leadership language about like strong, resilient leaders who are leading change, and the spiritual formation literature that comes out of our Christian tradition about the kinds of leaders who can persevere under trial, who can have hupomone, like perseverance. And when you started pulling them together, you started realizing that resilience is a formative task, and that what we needed to do is think about how we formed leaders for being able to handle the hardest part of the task, which is the resistance of their own people, which we could talk about in more depth. And so it really is a formative book. It's a book on leadership formation. How do you form leaders to have the resilience to face the resistance that comes from your own people when you're trying to lead change?
Okay, so wow, there's so much here that I want to unpack. I think I would love to first off start with, let's unpack this idea of leadership. And here's what I mean by that. I think one of the things that when I've chatted with leaders about adaptive leadership, some of the pushback that I sometimes receive, and it's meaningful pushback, is, ought we be careful as church ministers of drawing too heavily from concepts that are shaped by practices outside the church? So for instance, how far can we take this conversation about leadership when sometimes those leadership principles are drawn from corporate sectors, right? And there was a season of my life, and I'm just being very honest here. Like when I early on, when I began my theological education, I called myself a theological purist. Like I wanted nothing to do with leadership literature until I found myself sitting behind the desk of the first church that I lead pastored, and then I realized like, oh, like there's something about having to move a group of people in a direction. Like there is something about that is really important for me to realize the deficits that I have in my own capacities. And so that sent me down a path of trying to improve my leadership capacity, my leadership competencies. But
Mm-hmm.
would you help us as we talk about leadership, as we talk about adaptive leadership and change management? Help us to understand, like, how do we navigate the tensions that exist with the unique calling of being a minister of the gospel and the work that calls us to, alongside of also learning to value the kinds of concepts that we draw from the Ronald Heifetzes of the world and those
Mm-hmm.
who have been incredibly helpful across the number of sectors, nonprofit, for profit. How do we balance that those challenges in that conversation?
Yeah. Well, let me answer it in two ways. One is because we're talking about this in the context of theological education. We do this all the time in theological education, right? Like, so the very fact that a good preaching class will also study rhetoric, like, and we know there are ways that human beings talk and speak to each other and communicate that come out of not just the scriptures, but come out of the entire experience of human communication, right? So if you have a pastoral counseling, they'll teach you stuff about empathy and emotional intelligence and these concepts that, for me as a Presbyterian, I put into the category of general revelation. And general revelation always has to be critiqued by specific revelation, special revelation, the revelation of Jesus. So for me, the question is, as I'm a follower of Jesus and what I believe in the authority of the scriptures, where do I believe I've seen things revealed in the world, right? Gravity, science, why I would take aspirin, why coffee can give you, caffeine can help, write a paper, right? Like stuff like that. Where do we see stuff revealed in the world that doesn't contradict, but actually is also better understood through the lens of the scriptures? So for me, the big part about this I see in the scriptures, you see in places like, here's one of my favorites. When we often talk to pastors today, and they'll say, I have a gift of being a shepherd. What most people today think about shepherd is people who are shepherd their flocks have lots of pastoral care. In the Old Testament, however, shepherds were military leaders. The shepherds were the kings and the military leaders. And the reason the idea of shepherd is the shepherd was to be the one who so deeply cared for the very soldiers you were taking into battle that they knew they were loved. So when God comes and announces, the prophets denounce the shepherds who harm the sheep, it's denouncing bad military leaders who were not shepherds after God's own heart, or like the shepherd, like Jesus is called to be. So the good shepherd is the one who lays down his life for the sheep, loves the sheep, cares for the sheep, but it's also leading the sheep. So even some of our metaphors we've taken to the church, and we actually take them away from their original context, which was much more robust because they're much more a part of everyday life. When Canoeing the Mountains first was being bought by the publisher, Bob Freiling, who was the publisher for InterVarsity Press, looked at me and said, your book is going to be for all those pastors who secretly read Harvard Business Review and they don't know how to make it apply to their church. And you're kind of an interpreter for them. And that's really what my academic world is. It's interpreting the integration of organizational leadership and spiritual formation. That's really where I live. And that's what even plays into my definition of leadership, which is leadership is energizing your own people to grow so they might be able to take on the task, the missional task in front of them. It is energizing people to their own transformation so that they might might fulfill the mission that God has given them. And so for me, it's always in that interaction.
Yeah, what a great way of explaining the work that you did with canoeing in the mountains. Because I was reading that at the same time that I was reading Cotter and Heifetz, and I had that thought. I was like, this is a way of making accessible their material in a way that can be transformative in congregations.
Yeah,
And I really
yeah.
think with that 27 years of ministry experience that you bring to the table, you're able to relate this kind of material, and really challenge maybe our even understanding of leadership and competencies, that I think are specific to leading through change in a way that is built upon the credibility of someone who's done this work in a pastoral setting, in a congregational
Mm.
setting, in a parish setting. That I think for me is just really helpful as I hand off your book to other leaders. I can say this is someone who's done it, who knows it, who understands it, and has practiced it. And so I really appreciate that work of translation that you do there. So let's talk about this a little further, because so you mentioned that as you were having conversations about canoeing the mountains, people are coming to you say, I don't know if that I have people that will, maybe that have the heart to see this all the way through. And I have to step into my empathy for a moment and go, my goodness, yes, because pastoring is hard enough, but then if you add this last year that many of us
Mm.
have faced, right? COVID, the racial
Yeah.
reckoning that is a part of all of our lives, the political upheaval, every bit of it. We're here. It can feel overwhelming because as a pastor, you know this, you're called to be, an expert in budgeting, an expert in leadership, an expert in how to lead a funeral, a wedding, all of these things. So now we have another layer added on, where church futurists are saying over and over again, everything's changed. Nothing will be the same. Adapt or die. And it can be crushing to a pastor who's just simply trying to hold on, to try to say, I've just weathered the most difficult year of my life ministerially, and I'm not even sure I've got another year in me. And now you're saying that I've got to
Hmm.
learn an entire different skill set. So would you help us as you've done your work? I know you consulted quite a bit, as you've researched. Help us understand that as we navigate this dynamic environment that is before us, how do we hold the constants of ministry with those elements that we must adapt, and how do we do so in a way that assesses well without becoming alarmist in the process?
Yeah, yeah. It's the right questions to be asking because we're all in the middle of it, right? So I say that um, everybody who comes to seminary, right? So somebody said to them, "You're the best Christian I know. You should go pro. You should go off to professional Christian school." And we think, they come off to our schools, we fill them full of education, they take a bunch of classes, and they graduate with a Master of Divinity. I mean, they sound like a superhero, right? They go into their congregations, and in some ways, they are the experts. Right? You're the person who opened the scriptures to me. Oh my gosh, you're the person who taught me to pray. You're the one who walked with my family through the worst tragedy. I mean, we are so grateful for you, Pastor. So now the world is changing. What should we do? And here's the hard part. At that moment, I now lead with the three hardest words for any human to say, which are, I don't know. You actually have to lead people. People trust you because you've been trustworthy in your competence, in your technical competence, and all the things we teach people. You're trustworthy with the scriptures and traditions. You're trustworthy with souls. You're even trustworthy with meetings. Like the person runs a good meeting. We appreciate that. Now you have to actually lead them in a process where we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know exactly what to do. So adaptive leadership says you get really, really clear on the most important thing, the essential, the thing that when I'm working with churches in consulting or coaching, I say we want to get really clear on your core DNA. What makes you a unique body, like a unique entity? And what is your charism? That's a phrase from our Catholic brothers and sisters that I just love. Like, what is our gift? What's the gift of our congregation to our community or to our movement or to the world? And that we're going to preserve, but we might have to let every single thing else go. So today I was talking with a person who works with me and she coaches, and she's coaching an African-American congregation in the South that has this amazing tradition of saying, well, our church is here particularly for African-American brothers and sisters who have been impoverished in a rural town, this is the place where they find a sense of community, a sense of dignity. They serve in the community. And one of their favorite things they do is they take people on trips, and they literally do trips together, almost like mission trips, but service trips, because we want them to feel empowered and to learn more about the world. It's just this is what's going to be great for this community. What happens when all of a sudden you're trying to reach a new generation and the new generation says to you, thanks very much, but we don't want to go on your trips? That doesn't sound very fun to us. But are you about the trips, or are you about some deeper value? And what happens if you're the person who spent your whole life organizing really great trips, mission trips, experiences, service trips, and nobody wants them anymore? But the deeper value wasn't the trip. The deeper value was the empowerment of people towards service and growth. So what do you hold on to and what do you leave? What do you hold to and what do you adapt? That's the discernment work that every leader is doing. And the painful part that they're having to grapple with is what you're having to let go. So you're having to learn, you're having to face loss. And one of the famous phrases from Raoul Heifetz is, people don't resist change, they resist loss. And when people start to resist, the hard part here is to be able to continue to stay with them through the process of grieving into their own transformation. And that's what really makes this process really hard. So for most of us, we weren't trained in that. We were trained to deliver pastoral care for people in a context where the culture gave us a home court advantage. We would care for whoever came to our church services, and there'd be enough. And now we're actually living in a world where sometimes people not only don't value the church, they're against the church. And so we find ourselves as being missionaries to a world that isn't sure they want what we have to offer. So now what are we called to be? What does it mean for us to be people who love God and love our neighbor, and embrace the changes that will be required of us to lead a community of people to do that?
Yeah, as I listen to you, I'm hearing some language here that maybe at some level challenges the way we even think about change, right? So one of the things that as I begin to work through the literature on adaptive leadership, one of the things I began to realize is that much of what we were calling change was tweaking systems that already existed, right? We were changing music. We weren't necessarily shifting paradigms, right? So, and Heifetz wants to talk to us, and you have mentioned even in your literature, the difference between maybe technical change versus adaptive change. So talk to us a little bit, because what you're talking about is theological. I mean, part of your work has been re-envisioning theological education and informing leaders to engage this world anew, right? So talk to us a little bit about how we understand change to operate within our ministry context. What is the difference between technical change and adaptive leadership? And what is the significance of that in the current setting that we are trying to find our way through as pastors?
Yeah, so the easiest way to think about this is technical challenges, technical problems are problems experts can solve. They're not necessarily simple. A heart bypass is a technical challenge. I always say people preaching a sermon on the Trinity without committing heresy is a technical challenge. It can be done. We're seminaries. We teach you how to do it, but it is not easy. And it's oftentimes not easy at all, but it can be done. What an adaptive challenge requires is it requires you to start with the fact that there is no expertise within our understanding. We're going to have to learn before we get there. So I'll give you an example. In the 1990s, they used to use the example of Wayne Gretzky, who was the best hockey player, and they said what made him so great. He said, "You skate to where the puck is going," right? So you try to anticipate and make changes, try to anticipate. Well, now I say we live in a world where there's 4 pucks going in 4 different directions. The game has totally changed. So you can't anticipate. So instead of learning how to predict the future and try to go to the future, you've got to learn a different way of leaning into the future when you can't predict. That's really hard. What are you going to do? Well, one of the examples of this that I learned from the folks that I get to work with in Silicon Valley is they would say, don't predict, prototype. Learn how to do small, modest experiments that you learn as you go and you grow from the things you learn. Take one step, figure out what you learn, take another step, figure out what you learn, and be really, really clear what you're not going to let go. There you go. Well, now that's really profoundly painful, because you start realizing that what we were trying to do with, say, changing the music was trying to figure out how to get younger generations into the church. What we weren't figuring out was that the deepest challenges of a changing generation had little to do with music taste and had everything to do with the fact that the world was changing so dramatically. We're asking totally different questions. And so today, 1 million millennials are leaving the church every year, 1 million. And so when you recognize that we're facing that, I don't think that's going to be solved by, kicking up the volume another notch. I think we're going to have to come up with a much deeper set of changes that, and, how do we continue to reach the people we love, the next generation, pass on the faith to the next generation in a way that we are not prepared to do so right now. There's not expertise in our midst.
Just saying that, I mean, you talked earlier about, we go off to school, we get a bachelor's degree, a master's of divinity. Some people end up with DMins, and then we find ourselves on the skating rink, recognizing that amidst all of that education, we're still not experts. There's still 4 pucks going. And in your book, you spend a good deal of time talking about vulnerability, right? And I would say there's few things more vulnerable than recognizing how little you know and how much you're still being called to lead people in the midst of your own ignorance, right? And uncertainty and the discoveries yet to be made. What do you find to be, as you've worked with a number of leaders, what do you find to be necessary in the character of the leader to make it possible for them to learn how to skate on an ice with 4 pucks going all at once, and to do so in a way that is healthy and sustaining? What's necessary in their character?
Well, and I want to just add even one more thing to what you said, Jeff, to make it so we know, so it feels as hard as almost the people listening will get. It's not only that you have to be a person who's able to figure out a game that has changed so dramatically. There's now 4 pucks going, so the rules aren't the same. It's not even that you're an expert in the old game. It's that everybody expects you to be an expert, so they're mad at you and they're yelling at you all at the same time. Right? So they're yelling at you because you don't know the game. They're mad at you, and they're disappointed in you, right? So Heifetz's famous definition of leadership is disappointing your own people at a rate they can absorb. And none of us got into leadership because we wanted to disappoint people. I would say, every one of us got into ministry because we love God and we love people. We want to introduce the people we love to the God we love, and we'll do so through the scriptures we love. Isn't this great? And now we have to actually show up in a place and say to people, the world is changing dramatically. We've been given a mission. We're not sure what to do next, and we are going to have to keep going. And I don't know the next thing. We're going to have to learn as we go. We're going to have to face losses, and we're going to have to discover our way forward. And what happens 100% of the time is that people will resist you and blame you. And that doesn't come out of leadership literature. That comes out of Exodus. We see that when Moses takes them through the Red Sea, right? Moses takes the Hebrews out of slavery. And when they are facing the Red Sea, they look at Moses and say, were there not enough graves? Now we've hit our first obstacle. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to blame the leader. He takes them through the Red Sea. Boom. Biggest miracle until the resurrection, right? 6 weeks later, because lunch is a little bit scarce, their tummies start to grumble. They're camping, and they weren't quite sure it was going to be this hard. 6 weeks after the greatest miracle any humans had ever seen, they are saying, oh, slavery. They killed our children, but we had leeks and onions for lunch. Maybe we should go back. And that experience is the experience that we have over and over again. God's own people do that. So what it requires of us is to become the kind of leaders who can calmly stay connected to these people, continue to live out the mission that God has given us, take these people through the wilderness to the promised land, let them be transformed so that they can become the kind of people who will be a blessing to every family in the world, Genesis, to Abram's family. This is your work. You are called to do it. Lead them through. And what I talk about in the book is that there's this great temptation for leaders to have what Ed Friedman calls the failure of nerve, which is as soon as they want to go back, you'll collude with them to go back. Sorry, I care about you so much, I won't push you. Or for some of us, we get it called the failure of heart, which is we get so angry and disillusioned and mad at our people, become cynical, and we get disconnected from them. And so resilience is the capacity to keep being formed so that you can continue to fulfill the mission that God has given for you as a people without having a failure of nerve or a failure of heart.
So as you talk about this failure of nerve and failure of heart, one of the elements of what you lay out in terms of your movement towards formation that really stuck with me was this idea of being a grounded leader. There's something about that idea of grounding. And I wonder if you would take some time and just share with us, because that seems to be such an essential characteristic for someone who can stay tenacious and resilient in the face of that pushback and that resistance. So can you talk to us a little bit about what you mean by a grounded leader and why that is so essential, and how can we grow in our groundedness?
Yeah. So this is so we talked about vulnerability as the first place as a leader, right? It's really where you end up feeling as if you are under, I always say that my dad loved the quote from Harry Truman. If you can't stand the heat, stay out of the kitchen. He would say, what I want to say is that heat isn't nearly hot enough. The kitchen is not hot enough. You got to actually be in the fire, and the fire of transformation is the vulnerability to feel standing before your people, having to lead them when they are disappointed in you. So what we discovered as we started looking at the research was that the raw material for a person who could do that is they have to be grounded in something other than their success as a leader. Like one of the very first things you've got to have is you've got to know you're called to lead these people and it may not work. You might be called to lead the people and you might die in the wilderness. You might have to lead these people and because they themselves have to go through their own transformation. You can only lead a people into transformation. They might have to go through it. It may not work. You won't have your ego built on your success as a leader. If you do, you will not be able to develop the resilience. So for me, how do you become more grounded? That's the gospel. Like what I literally say that the most important thing for me as a religious leader is I have to believe the gospel. And what I got to believe is the words of Jesus, and the experience Jesus had is the experience I'm going to have, which is what Jesus heard is the very first thing he heard before he had spoken a word, before he'd done a miracle, before he confronted the power, before he'd done anything is, "You are my beloved child." Eugene Peterson quoted it, "You are the pride of my life." Don't you love that? You are the pride of my life. What I want, and the whole reason why I talk about leadership needs to be formed and resilience is formed, is it starts with the belief that you are not a leader to earn anything from God. You are a leader in response to the pain of the world, and that you are called to lead a people to respond to the pain of the world. But it starts with you knowing that whether you are successful or not, in any way that you measure success, what matters is that you know you are already loved. You are grounded in the love of God who knows you before you've done anything, and it loves you already. And that's really critical, because the rest of the things characteristics we're going to top of that, like teachability or humility, attunement or empathy, adaptability, tenacity, all depend upon your capacity to know deeply that you are already loved. As a nun once said in a sermon that I heard, you were loved into existence. You were loved into existence.
That is powerful. And as I was listening to you, I could not help but think that our measurements and our metrics seem to discourage that kind of groundedness.
Yeah.
Because as leaders in the church, I think we've been prone to evaluate ourselves based upon our outcomes. And And can you speak to that a little bit? Can you speak to the assessment of ministry significance outside of what we commonly assume to be the lead measures for our ministry success, and what does it look like to step in and to embrace? I mean, in adaptive environments, you have to embrace a kind of significance that can't be measured in the same ways. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? What have you seen in the lives of those who have done that successfully and done that well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one of the parts really that I think happens to leaders is to come back to that notion of, I know I'm loved by God, and I also know I'm called by God. This is mine to do. This is my task to do. Until God releases me from it, this is what I'm called to do. These are my people. This is my task. This is what I'm called to do. And that sense of calling becomes really important because, calling oftentimes is really the heart of witness. So what is the witness of the testimony of Jesus Christ in the world? There's people who said, I'm called to be a witness. Well, in Greek, it's also the word martyrdom. So when Peter Jesus and says, how dare you talk about dying? Jesus' response, behind me, Satan, right? If Jesus used Satan, it's a bad day. That's a really bad day for an apostle. And so, what was it he did? He said, you have to die. No, we're going to stop you. And right to, taking swords out in the garden, we're going to stop that from happening. So success was not about military might, which is what the view of the Messiah would be, the military leader who would liberate from Roman oppression. God had a different idea. In John 12, it's really clear. Jesus says, unless a seed falls to the earth and dies, it remains alive. If it dies, it bears much fruit. So what is success in our life? It is being fruitful for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of the kingdom. And I always say to every pastor that I work with, I said, I want your church to thrive. I would love your church to have a legacy in your town of loving the people in the name of Jesus for hundreds of years. But none of Paul's churches exist today. The movement of the gospel exists, but none of those churches are there today. So continue to hold on to. What do you hold on to? What do you let go of? What becomes most important? What adapt? What do you adapt so that the most important things can continue on? That's ultimately what leadership's about. And we're in it right now. I think in our culture, we're in a crisis about this because many of us who've been shaped by Christendom, which is where Christianity had a home court advantage, think that the goal of Christianity is more influence in Christendom, a stronger Christendom. And that's one of the reasons right now we have the church in a really hard place about working about power and culture and politics and all the things that are related to that.
That's good. That's good. So as we talk about this leading congregations towards change and how fraught it is with danger, right? And you mentioned Heifetz's quote that leadership is about disappointing people at a rate that they can handle. Let's talk a little bit about empathy here, because when I first read John Cotter's book on leading change, he's got those beautiful 8 steps, and I find those steps to be incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
But there is something, again, and one of the things I find so helpful about your book is the way in which it hones in on the character of the leader. Because you can lead people through 8 steps and still be completely unaware of self, someone who doesn't understand the struggles that people are facing. You don't attend to or attune yourself to what they're dealing with, the questions that they're asking, they don't feel heard. And you seem to suggest to us that empathy is this vital component. Can you talk to us about the role that empathy plays in significant and meaningful leadership as you seek to bring change to your congregational context?
Yeah. So the key part about empathy is this. Empathy is our capacity to feel and understand and experience what other people experience. And mostly when a leader is empathic, the people who the leader is relating to with feel felt. They will say, I often say, your goal as a leader is not to get everybody in your church to say, "Oh, you're right, pastor, you're right." Your goal is when they listen to you to have them say, that's right. That's right. You understand me. You understand what it's like. Not your right, but what you said is right because that is how you understand me. When people feel felt, then trust even what they don't know. So when people are following us into the unknown, it's not because they're convinced we're right. It's because they're convinced that we understand them and love them and care for them, and that they can trust with the next step into the darkness. It's what happens with Jesus' followers when the crowds leave him and he looks at them and says, so are you going to leave me too? Miracle of the bread and the loaves. Everybody's excited. We cross the sea. We come back. They go do the bread trick one more time. The answer is no. I'm not going to feed you one more time. They all leave. And he looks at the disciples and says, are you going to leave too? And they say, where else will we go? You're the one with the words of eternal life. And I think at that moment, it was a really sad moment. I don't think they were going, where else will we go? I think they were saying, we know you're the ones with the words of eternal life, but we do not like where this is going. So we don't have any other place to go. So we're going to stay with you. So I would say empathy is important because what we know from brain science is when people feel empathized, literally brains start firing together. It's the reason why, people who know each other can finish each other's sentences and can laugh at jokes that aren't finished because they have this that sense of brains firing together. That's attunement, and attunement accelerates change. People stay with us when they know that we understand them and get them.
Wow. So that's powerful. That's powerful stuff. So talk to us a little bit now, because it feels like all of this sort of moves us to even the conversation about managing reactivity, which is, again, another key concept. Talk to us a little bit about what does it mean to manage reactivity in the midst of leading through this crucible of change?
Yeah. So this comes out of, if you want to talk about general revelation, this comes out of the work of family systems theory, right? So in family systems theory, one of the things that we know is that family systems, my wife's a marriage and family therapist. We have a school of psychology at Fuller, so there's a lot of this conversation that says that in family systems theory, the relationships are actually more powerful than the individual parts, right? And so all of us know that, right? The experience that I had as a young man holding my child who has just been born and realizing, oh my gosh, what just happened in the last 30 seconds, I don't even know, but I will rearrange my world for this little one, because something that is happening when I held this little baby shifted who I am. The power of the relationship is even more powerful than the constituent parts. It's like two planets that are in the same orbit. That's the power that holds us together. That's also the power that can become dysfunctional in a system where the cohesiveness doesn't allow individuals to grow. Okay, so all that is a backdrop. What it really points to is this: when you start doing changes in a church system, you're messing with a family system. We are a relational system. And the scriptures say that we're brothers and sisters, right? We are in the same family of God. So I said the hard part about being a pastor is that you're literally leading a family. This is the place when I say this, people who have family businesses, all of a sudden light bulbs go on. They go, oh my God, the most complicated part about a family business is that, the so-and-so who didn't do a very good job, who you want to happens to be your kid's favorite uncle, is coming over for Thanksgiving dinner, right? So like families have inherent relationships. Businesses have a mission. The church is a family with a mission. That's what we learn in Genesis 12. I'm going to bless your family, and through your family, all the families of the earth are going to be blessed. So that reality means that the energy in the family is one of the most difficult parts. I said to say all that to say, when we talk about managing reactivity, what we're saying is when you make changes in a church system and people get really mad, they're experiencing loss, they're angry. I mean, I've had people literally look at me and say stuff like, you are taking away my church. If your response to that anger is to be reactive back, how dare you say that? I'm not a person who would do that. it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. The only way that you can take people through loss is by being able to manage your own reactivity and stay calm. And at the risk of offending somebody, I don't mean to. If you want to see a master class in this, the television show that's out right now called Ted Lasso is a master class in non-reactivity, because it is a television show about an American football coach who goes to England. He ends up in England to coach soccer that he knows nothing about, and literally stands of people call vulgarities at him because they're so disappointed that their team is doing so bad. And he has the capacity to just stay there calmly, knowing that of course they're mad, we're losing, but I've got an agenda that is bigger than that. I want to transform the lives of these people. I want to coach my players. And that ability to be non-reactive is critical to being able to take people through the change process. And it's really very hard. I mean, it's hard for all of us. And so the first thing you've got to be able to do is manage your own reactivity. If you get reactive to people's anger, if you don't see it as part of the family system, you think they're pointing it toward you, you never be able to help shift the system.
Oh, this is rich. This is rich. I want to do two things now. I want to maybe invite you to share a little bit from your own story of leading a congregation for the length that you did and how resilience was formed in you. And then I want to also be able to turn it over to Dr. Quanstrom, because I don't know, Dr. Quanstrom, if you've had questions submitted to you, but I'm sure you listening as someone. So Dr. Quanstrom, just so you know, Tod, is the Dean of School of Theology and Christian Ministry, but he's also a pastor of the church that sits on the campus as well, and has been pastoring for now more than 2 decades. Let's just say he's for a little while. And so I'm sure that much of what you've been saying has been resonating through the work and leadership that he's been doing. So I'm sure you have some questions, but could you just first start by sharing maybe how this has been forged in your life through your ministry experience?
Yeah. So the first part of that adaptive change came right out of my experience leading the church in San Clemente. I went there when the church had just come through a crisis. They had their pastor and their associate pastor both leave in the middle of some experiences of disappointment and moral failure. The church had lost half of its membership. They had lost 100 families, and I came there as a 33-year-old pastor with a young family. They literally brought me there to be the technical solution. Oh, we'll get a young guy with a young family that'll bring the families back. I didn't understand that at the time. But what I realized is what they really wanted was for me to be a young guy who was very comfortable leading an old church. They were older folks. And when I would say stuff like, we're going to have to make changes to reach the generation, we had to figure out how to frame that and work on that. And we made some decisions and some things changed. And we went through a trajectory where for 10 straight years, we had growth. And so when every marker was going up and to the right in the way you wanted to go, I actually found myself in a crisis one day because I realized that while our metrics were going up, our morale was going down. And I couldn't figure it out. I didn't know what to do. I thought, like, why, if everything is going in the right direction, why are my best leaders all dropping out of leadership and pulling back? So we brought in a consultant from the outside, which I think can sometimes be really helpful. They can see stuff you can't see. And they basically came back, and the consultant did a deep dive on our church and said, look, all the metrics that you look at are good. He even looked at me and said, if I lived here, I would raise my daughters in this church. It's a really fine church. The problem at the moment, Tod, is everybody here thinks they're participating in your ministry. I wanted to throw up. Like, this was not what I wanted to, like, I had done that intentionally. He said, your strongest leaders are all pulling away because they want to have a ministry. They was literally trying to tell me, like, you're almost like creating like Tod Bolsinger ministry at San Clemente Presbyterian Church. Your best people are leading. I said, it's all about you. They praise you because you brought the church back out of this painful spot. So they all trust you. But then they think it's all about you. And so they're healthy enough to not want to participate in that. What are you going to do? Literally, I said, what do I do? He goes, well, you got 3 choices. One is you can resign. If you resign to figure out a different way to lead, you can leave. And you're probably at a place in your career where you get another job and that'll be fine. I didn't want to. They said, or you can do nothing. You can do another 10 years here. After a while, it'll go into a crisis. And then people look back at the glory days of when you led, and you'll still look good. It'll be bad. You can learn to lead all over again. And that's really what I do. I had to figure out how to learn to lead all over again. And what was really hard was I had to figure out, this is where I'd never heard of adaptive leadership. I'd never heard of any of this stuff. I had to learn all of it because my way of leading had been built upon what I had learned from my mentors, and that the way I was leading was not going to take us to the next place, and that I had to basically grapple with that. The hard part was as I started changing my leadership would be less about me and more about the way in which we go through our transformation together, the way in which we learn and face losses together. The hardest part is how disappointed people were in me. I had literally people look at me and say, you used to be such a good, strong leader, and it feels like you just fire in the belly. And that was so simple, because the temptation for me, of course, was to go back and seize that back. And yet I understood God wanted to do something in the life of the church that would be bigger than me, that required me to lead them through a process of transformation. And so that's, when that's ultimately the process I had to go through in my own experience. I talk about Canoeing the Mountains. But it's also led to sabotage, which is what I had to grapple with in tempered resilience. What do you do when you're leading people and the very people who called you to lead then resist your leadership? Which happens. Edwin Friedman says it happens 100% of the time. So, yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I appreciate you sharing that. Dr. Quanstrom, I wanted to give you a few moments. I'm sure that you have a few questions that you'd love to ask and to have a bit of a conversation here. So why don't you ask Todd some questions here?
A couple of comments. I have thoroughly enjoyed the conversation. It is, I don't know that leaders are typically given permission to adapt. I don't know that leaders are given permission to say, I don't know. I don't know that leaders are given permission to disappoint people at a rate that the people can handle. I mean, that's a great definition of leadership, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think our egos are inclined to want to fulfill other people's expectations of what they think a leader should be, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Is that fair?
Yes.
So the leadership that you're talking about in this text is the opposite of coercive leadership. It's the opposite. You're not imposing change on people because you know better. You acknowledge on the front end that you are not the expert, right? And as you're talking about Moses, it occurred to me that Moses was pretty invested because he was in the wilderness with the people. I mean, what the decisions he was making were going to impact him as well, right? So there's this incredible withness with the peopleness of his leadership, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So it seems to me that this would be incredibly liberating for pastors to not have to be the expert. And it seems to me that coming to your people, maybe they would resist the I don't know answer that you might have for them, but it seems to me that they might embrace it because they probably knew that before you did. I mean, they sometimes have a more realistic assessment of our leadership abilities than we do. So I'm just kind of encapsulating, and I want to make sure that I'm understanding what you're saying before I ask any questions. Is this fair?
Yeah, I think the hardest part about this, Dr. Quanstrom, is that we have set up pastors to be the experts.
Right.
Right. So when we're not, we actually have to reset the expectation of what spiritual leadership is. And this is where I say, for me, and this is like the book I'm working on now, the next book, it's the integration of discipleship and spiritual formation and adaptive capacity.
Perfect.
Because the key reminder is that my core identity is not as a leader, it is as a disciple. And disciples are learners. So what I always say is my job as a leader is to lead the learning. We are going to grow. We're going to be transformed. I'm going to be transformed too. I mean, this is the part about being a younger pastor going to a church. They grew me up. Like I had to grow up with them, right? And so that reality, it's got to be the reality that we all have. And so, but we have to set that expectation and grow through that together. And that's hard in a world where people want to be experts, right? Just notice what's happening even today, say with COVID. When our scientists say stuff like we are learning as fast as we can, then you have a whole group of people saying, well, then how can we trust you? Right?
Yes. Connecting humility, vulnerability, ignorance to spiritual disciplines. This is simply the confessional posture.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right? This is just saying, I am who I am before the Lord and before you. Let's figure this out together. It also seems to me, I'm trying to lead. I'm just trying to understand. Okay, so that the congregation that you're leading, since we're talking about the pastoral leadership, the congregation has a corresponding responsibility to lead as well.
Yes.
So the pastor doesn't come in as the quote unquote leader and the sheep are to follow, but the pastor has also the privilege to learn from the leadership of his people. Is that fair?
Oh yeah, actually, so one of my favorite books, the book that's been really shaping for me in the last few years, has been Rabbi Jonathan Sacks' commentary, Lessons on Leadership. He was the chief rabbi of London. He just away this last months ago. He typed it, and then he took his team through the Torah. And in their Torah studies, they kept looking at how does adaptive leadership apply to the Torah. And one of the most important things he said was, at the heart of being a Jew is the belief that everybody is a leader, because everybody is going to influence some part of the world for the sake of the glory of God, for the sake of the repair of the world, the healing of the world, the tikkun olam, right? Everybody participates in that. That's what it means to be Jewish. Like, to be Jewish means you are the repairers of the breach, you family that blesses all the families. That's what it means to be called. So it means that your job as a leader is not just to get a bunch of people who are followers to do what you want them to do. It is to form them into people who participate in what God is doing to bring healing to the world. And that, for me, becomes the transformative part about being a pastor. That my job is to help all of us be transformed so we can participate in what God is doing to bring God's mission to the world, of healing the world. So now it is always a formative task. The problem, of course, is that what we've done for the last 50 years is we built church models on the notion of you come, engage in the church, support what we're doing, and we will provide your spiritual resources and your spiritual needs. And it's taken away that empowering discipleship, co-formational experience.
Well, so we don't live up to our own theology, as you know, and
Exactly.
corresponding the Christian theological truth that corresponds to that Jewish notion is priesthood of believers in our tradition.
Perfect. Yes, that's exactly right. Right. Yeah.
So the pastor doesn't have a secret hotline to the Lord any more than any one of his parishioners. That if he really embraced priesthood of believers, that part of the adaptive leader, and again, I'm just processing what you've been talking about.
Exactly.
Is this okay? One of the tasks of the leader is to trust the Spirit's work among his people as well.
Yeah.
Right? So adaptive leadership is discerning the will of God among God's people.
Yep.
Is that fair?
Yes. So when they talk about being a royal priesthood, right, a priest of kings, right, a kingdom of priests, right, here's a group of people who have authority inherent in every person. So the work we're doing, this is why I always say that this is a very interesting little switch. In many places, leadership language, the pastor or the leader is told, give us a vision. What is the vision? You have the prophetic vision. Adaptive leadership says the vision is the ability to see the pain of the world and call people to change to meet that pain.
Right.
It's not some glorious picture of success. It is the need of the world, what Jim Collins calls the brutal fact of the world, and then call people in the name of God, for the sake of the glory of God, to meet that need. And that's so what we're called to do is help people to see and then participate in the solving of the pain.
So this is Emmanuel then.
Yeah, yeah.
This is how we're following in the footsteps of our Lord by entering into the loss of the world for the sake of the kingdom, right? Is that fair?
Yep. And our job. So I always say, whenever so for 27 years I preached, and for 17 years I preached a different sermon every week because that's what I did as senior pastor. Today as a seminary professor and a leadership person, I have about 4 sermons that I get to do over and over again. So they're not bad, but one of them I often talk about is that the most disruptive thing Jesus did is he disrupted the Shema, like the great teaching of what it meant, the greatest commandment, the greatest single, right? I would say Jesus was bad at math. He was told to give one answer, and he gave 2, right? What is the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God and love your neighbor as yourself. As you say that loving your neighbor is the same as loving God, you have disrupted what it means to be devoted to God, right?
Right.
Then worship is how we need to be transformed because we love God in order to love our neighbor.
Right. Well,
and that's what the adaptation is, right?
Yes. Yeah. This is incredibly refreshing. Every leader ought to be relieved to read this. It allows us to be right as we are. It doesn't absolve us from leading. We still have the call. We still are required to lead. So this is not a delegation of authority in any way. It is a descriptor of how we ought to lead as leaders in the church, right?
Yes. And for me, it's also, to me, the genius of the congregation. Like my favorite thing when we run these cohorts where we take small groups of leaders from a church through an 18-month cohort with like 20 other churches, like through this process. The first thing we have them do is spend a lot of time talking about what they love about their church, their actual core values, not what they aspire to be, but what they actually are, and what their charism is. What is your gift? What is the thing that you give to the world? And I always say that, your goal as an adaptive leader is that gift, that charism, become adapted in a healthy way to meet the pain of the world. So the famous rabbinic tale that says, when Zusa, the rabbi, comes before the judgment day, God wants to judge him. He won't say, "Why were you not Moses? Why were you not?" Right? He'll answer is, "Why were you not Zusa? I already had a Moses."
Exactly right.
And what I want to say to every congregation is your goal isn't to figure out how you can be like some famous other church or the cool church down the street or the church you wish you were pastoring. It's why are you not being the congregation that I, by my Spirit, implanted in this place, raised up, protected, and cared for so that you could have a witness in the midst of the pain of the world. Why were you not you? And adaptive leadership is about that. It's about becoming the healthiest version of yourself in the midst of a changing world so that the mission of God can go forward.
One of the most helpful things you said tonight, I thought, was understanding church as a family system. And I think we tend to see persons in the church as kind of disparate individuals or aggregation of people. And as leaders, we do not appreciate well enough the loss of changing that family system. Does that make sense? So we're kind of blind by it. And I think we're intended to then spiritualize the opposition instead of recognizing it as a cry of grief regarding this changing. I mean, anybody who's done any kind of family counseling knows that sometimes the ill health of one of the members works functionally well in that family system. And if one of the family members gets healthy, it just turns into conflict, right?
Yeah.
So if you wouldn't mind speaking one more time to the church as a family system that leaders as pastors must tend to, so that they're not either blindsided or misguided in their assessment of what really is going on in that loss. Does that make sense, the question?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So I always tell people this. Remember this. The root words for familiar and family are the same root word. So when you take a people into some place that is unfamiliar, their emotional experience about being in an unfamiliar place or doing unfamiliar tasks or having an unfamiliar worship service. Like I once had a worship leader who dared to change the doxology, like a little bit, right? When you take people into an unfamiliar experience, what viscerally they're experiencing is like they've lost their home.
Right.
They are orphaned. They're anxious. They're like I said, they're like the little kid in the grocery store who lost track of mom. They're screaming, running through the aisles until they find mom again. So what happens to us when we are in unfamiliar territory is we want to run home to mama. And we want to go back to anything that is familiar, including if it's dysfunctional. We would prefer to be at home in Egypt as slaves than liberated on the path to the promised land in a wilderness that is causing us to have to go through transformation. So that's the power of family systems in a good way. It holds us together through thick and thin, but it's also the debilitating part if we don't realize that the system has to keep growing for each person to be able to grow.
Yeah, that was really helpful. I just want to say thank you for your sensitivity and for writing the text. For what it's worth, if I wasn't a Nazarene, I would be a Presbyterian, and I'm not simply being patronizing for the sake of the attention to the written word and because Presbyterians have great preachers. So there.
Yeah, thank you. That's very kind of you. Yeah, that's very kind. I appreciate that.
As I was sitting there listening, there is a sense that ministry leadership can set you up for a double wounding and a double joy.
Yeah.
And I think what I mean by that is that the double wounding can come from recognizing the pain of the world and seeing in the people that God has raised up for the sake of the world a resistance to wanting to engage it, a dereliction of duty.
Yeah.
And that can wound you, because if you're amongst them, if they're your family, that hurts. That's painful.
Yeah.
But then there's this double joy of when the leader, as a part of that congregation, is given those glimpses, those kingdom glimpses of moments in which the congregation marshals their collective giftings and graces and charisms for the sake of this broken world, and we begin to see these moments where the world is made a little bit better because of what they've done. There's this deep joy that reverberates the soul of the leader.
Yeah.
And I imagine holding on to those moments of joy are pretty important, and probably pretty necessary to manage resilience when the double wounding comes. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, indeed. When you think about the joy, for the set before him, Jesus endured the cross. So what ultimately, for me, the ultimate sense of joy is this foretaste that I am participating in something bigger than myself. It is a foretaste of the reign of God. It is that I get to give my contribution into something much bigger than myself, that is worthy of myself, that is worthy of my life. And us who kids or grand will do a lot for the sake of something bigger than yourself, even one, right? And I think that part of what we have to recover in leadership is this notion that adaptive leadership is ultimately, it's long, slow work about helping the church become more and more faithful to the work that it is going to do over generation. Adaptation sometimes takes generation. And I have to come to me and say stuff like, how fast do you get out of the adaptive phase so you can start actually just executing the mission you want to do? And I said, well, I'm guessing that since Christendom was about 1700 years on, and we're about 10 minutes past Christendom, just disrupted with COVID, I think it's probably going to be my generation, your generation, and maybe one more, at least for this moment. So we're all going to do this. So what does it mean for you to be faithful in such a way that maybe grandchildren?
Right.
That's the Jeremiah question, right? right? The whole Jeremiah question, for I know the plans I have for you. Well, the plan, you're going to be in exile for 70 years. So in the meantime, be faithful in such a way that 70 years from now, there will be a witness that will come out of exile and that will take the mission forward. That adaptive leadership is about that work. It's about doing, and to me, the joy is participating in something so much bigger than myself that it'll be caught up in the work of the Hallelujah chorus in the renewed creation.
What you just named there, I think, points to the primary character that you used throughout Tempered Resilience, which was Martin Luther King Jr.
Yeah,
who, as he moves to this last moment of his life, begins to give these foretastes that in a sense he probably knew what was coming, and he says, I might not see it.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and yet he knew how deeply that call was in his life to continue to give himself to this moment, so that Israel was a so that community, the church is a so that community, so that something beyond them can continue to emerge. And so I appreciate this conversation so much, Tod. I will tell you this, what you're describing here is so unlike what we are accustomed to applaud and celebrate in today's culture regarding ministerial leadership. And it may be one of the reasons why we keep seeing the collapses of platforms, right? And people on these platforms, because we've pressured people to embody something that may be out of sync with what it means to be a vulnerable, humble, resilient leader who's been forged in the fires of change. And I'm left with this thought. Jacob spent the rest of his life with a limp. And it could be that somehow the kinds of leadership that we're executing within the church is both blessing and limp leaving. And it may be that limp that is the humility that we need to manage this kind of adaptive change well. So indeed. Well, this has been a rich evening and a rich conversation. Thank you so much, Tod. Thank you for carving out this time and being with us this evening. Thank you, those of you who are on this call, and for your participation in this evening. I pray that it was a rich experience for you as it was for us. We will edit this, and then this will go back up on the Center for Theological Leadership's YouTube page. I do want to encourage you and remind you that next month we're Deirdre Brau-Lotz, and she's going to be speaking to us about the gospel in a post-Christian world. And then in May, we're going to have a dual conversation with Tara Beth Leach and Scott McKnight, who are going to speak to us about the church, and both from Tara Beth's book Radiant Church, and then from Scott McKnight's book Tov. They're gonna share with us there. So we would encourage you to be a part of that, and look forward to your further participation. What a great evening, Dr. Quanstrom. Thank you, Tod. Thank you so much. What a gift this evening has been. Blessings to you all, and we will see you next time.